I'm from Catalysis Institute. I should declare myself as a chemist rather than an engineer. So I'm sure most people in the room understand these processes in much better detail than myself. But of course, I'm more interested in the chemistry that we can kind of stimulate in these environments and how we can apply those to catalysis. So over the next probably 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'll start off just by reintroducing some people to catalysis. I appreciate not everybody thinks about it 5 days a week, sometimes 6, like I do. And then I'll talk about the key differences between using supercritical CO2 as a prep method with preparing catalysts against more conventional methods. And then I'm going to pick out one case study of where we've utilized this kind of technology to great effect in the preparation of catalysts. I'm going to touch on very briefly how we can do chemical reactions in supercritical CO2 and possible opportunities for that in the future. And I'll just bring it all together as a summary. So most of you, hopefully all of you, will be familiar with the catalyst in some regard. We obviously have them in our exhaust of our cars. Enzymes are biological catalysts. But the type of catalyst that I'm interested in is a heterogeneous catalyst. And these are often formed of supported nanoparticles, like the electron microscopy images I've shown on the right-hand side. Sometimes they're in the form of mixed methyl oxides, such as the perovskite that I've shown on the left-hand side. But the key sort of takeaway from this slide is that they're major materials in the global economy and of very high importance. So about 90% of chemical processes use a catalyst. And altogether, it has a sort of 30 to 40% contribution towards the global GDP. So it's a big business. And one stat that always absolutely staggers me is that about half the nitrogen that you find in your body originated in the Haber-Bosch process, which is the synthesis of ammonia, which then is a key starting point in the production of fertilizers, which of course facilitates the sort of crop production on the scales required to sustain a population of our size. And in fact, there's quite clear correlations between the development of this process and the explosion of the human population in the early 20th century, for good or bad. But yeah, catalysis is important. So as a chemist interested in developing catalysts and understanding them, I'm interested at the atomic scale, what's happening. So this helpful graphic that I got from Wikipedia shows the various scales of how you can look at catalysts. Over on the left-hand side here, we have an atomic scale surface. You can see we have active sites here. And my job is to try and maximize the number of these active sites and also discover new and novel ones. And in the context of today's talk, using supercritical CO2, we can in particular focus on how we can achieve maximizing these active sites, inhibiting the segregation of these sites, and also understanding the surface of nanomaterials in more detail. So thinking about conventional catalyst preparation methods, there are a lot of positives. That's why they're used very commonly. They're often very easy to use, they're very scalable, but in many contexts, there are drawbacks to them. And some of those involve the fact that you have to use toxic precursors or solvents. Sometimes the introduction of impurities such as sodium is inevitable. If you use a precipitating agent, it might be something like sodium hydroxide or sodium carbonate. This can introduce impurities which require extra washing steps. And you also have fairly limited control of the aging and of your precipitate and the chemistry that occurs. Not always, but certainly in some instances. And this in turn affects or limits the composition of your precipitate. So there's a schematic here which shows you a sol gel precipitation type preparation. And this could also be a co-precipitation. They're pretty similar conceptually, but essentially you start off with a precursor and your solvent. You stimulate some kind of sol formation, perhaps by changing the pH. And you allow this to age, and then you have a drying step and finally a calcination step. So one important aspect is the drying, and you can see this branch includes a supercritical drying stage. So we can use supercritical CO2 to dry our materials, and that retains the porous structure much more efficiently. I'm not going to talk about that today, but that is another whole aspect of catalyst preparation and materials preparation, which I think we've touched on already today. So if we contrast that to sort of the SAS precipitation, the anti-solvent precipitation, I don't think there's a huge amount I have to add. I think Lewis and Elizabeth are getting a great overview of this in sufficient detail this morning, so I won't repeat too much. But just to kind of reiterate that we're using metal salts in organic and aqueous solvents, and we're pumping these with a coaxial nozzle with supercritical CO2, and then we're inducing a very rapid precipitation, which is what gives us our catalyst precursor. So what perhaps I can add to the discussion, and something that might be not necessarily unique to catalyst preparation, but certainly of more importance to catalyst preparation, is the presence of water. So if you were to do this kind of SAS preparation just in the presence of our organic solvent and our metal acetate salt, we would precipitate out our acetate. However, if we add a small amount of water, typically 1 to 5 volume percent, we can actually induce some chemical changes in the equipment, which affects our precipitate composition quite heavily, and is of very high importance when it comes to the actual catalyst structure. So the presence of water stimulates the production or the formation of carbonic acid, which in turn can release carbonate ions, and these can be incorporated into our final precipitate. So rather than just precipitating out acetates or acetals, we can precipitate out carbonates, hydroxycarbonates, and sometimes hydroxides. And I'll talk a little bit more about why this is important later on, but just to say that this is a kind of active chemical process as well as a diffusion, precipitation, or kind of solvent process as well. So just to summarize the advantages of SAS in terms of catalyst preparation, it's very versatile. Of course, you can use it for as many compounds as you can obtain metal precursors for. We can avoid non-toxic solvents sometimes. Obviously, methanol is toxic, but ethanol is certainly less toxic. And we also can avoid using nitrate and chloride precursors, which can be very harmful in favor of some organic precursors, which are not as bad. As I'll hopefully demonstrate, we can have high control of the different phases that are forming. We can form very small primary particle sizes, which can lead to very high specific surface areas. And we can run it in a continuous or semi-continuous mode. It's also scalable, and I won't talk about that today, but I think someone later on this afternoon will certainly cover that topic. And certainly from an academic's point of view, probably most important is that we can form interesting materials. And we have the luxury in some cases of pursuing interest-led science and research. So certainly the interest in these materials is central to why we pursue projects with them. So I'll conclude the introduction to this part just by touching on some of the structural differences between conventional preparations and the SAS preparations to hopefully give you a visual idea that we are making different materials. So on this slide, we have some SEM images. On the top, we have a sol gel, or I think it may be co-precipitation in this case, formation of a metal oxide. You get this typical sort of flaky morphology, whereas with the SAS method, we get these kind of conjoined or extended agglomerates, which I think are consistent with some of the images shown in the previous two presentations. And this is a sort of general phenomena. There are exceptions, but often you'll find these kind of extended agglomerates being formed. If we zoom in a little bit more and we switch to transmission electron microscopy, you can see that there are differences with this 100 nanometer scale bar. In the case of the sol gel, you have a very different morphology. And again, in the case of the SAS materials, you get these extended agglomerates. These are pre-calcination, so these are actually catalyst precursors. To form our active catalyst, we need to then calcine these in air. So it might be 300 degrees in flowing air for, say, 5 or 6 hours. That forms the oxide rather than the precipitate. And once we do that, we find that we have an evolution of the nanostructure even more. And in some cases, again, if you control the parameters correctly, you can form these hollow nanostructures. And again, this is a general observation, which can be independent of the metal oxide you're forming. So it's possible for, say, cerium oxides, zirconium oxides, and many more. The understanding of this mechanism is been fairly well elucidated by various researchers, but essentially in your precipitate, you do retain some of this organic solvent, and then during calcination, that's removed. And because of the precipitation of your material around the edge of your nanosphere, you actually end up with this hollow morphology. One of the open questions in the literature is whether these are accessible or not. And something that we've done really recently at Cardiff is develop this electron tomography reconstruction of our SAS-made materials. And so we can achieve this by taking 2D images of our material at different angles. So we do what we call tilt series, and then using an algorithm, we can reconstruct the image in 3 dimensions. And what this video shows as we go through the cross section is you have some of these internal pores that are red, and some of them are more of a turquoisey kind of teal color. The ones that are red are actually accessible, so we could get gas molecules in there, reactants, whereas the teal ones are inaccessible. So as I said before, the technical problems, one of the open questions in the literature is actually how accessible these are. And so this is really new data that we've got in the last few weeks and months at Cardiff. So it's unpublished, but we've been able to kind of answer that question. And it should open up possibilities for kind of more advanced material design in the context of catalysis. We could support a nanoparticle in there, and this would have very good thermal stability. So there are certainly avenues for this. As I said, these are interesting materials, but do they work? And the talk would be very short, despite the technical problems. The answer was no. So I'm pleased to say that they do work. And so I've included a few examples here, but there are several, if not dozens more. So today I'm going to concentrate on one of the more successful case studies that we have had in Cardiff, and this is in the context of copper zinc oxide catalysts. So specifically, these are the active and the commercial catalysts for the low temperature water gas shift reaction, which is this reaction here, and also the synthesis of methanol, which is traditionally carried out using CO, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen. More recently, there's been a lot of interest in actually starting from CO2. And so as part of the CO2 utilization drive, we can actually also produce methanol as well as water. But today's materials chiefly will be in the context of water gas shift. So you can see from the photograph on the right-hand side, this kind of chemistry, this kind of process is done on an enormous scale. The industry is worth billions. Over 100 million tons of ammonia is produced every year. That's over 10 years old now. Methanol production is also enormous. And so the hydrogen we generate in this reaction is then fed into the Haber-Bosch process, which produces the ammonia, which I touched on at the start of the talk. The original patent for this was filed in 1963. So it's a very mature topic as far as catalysis is concerned. And so these copper zinc oxide catalysts have been known about for quite some time. But despite this, we've still had interest in developing them and understanding them. So one project, and this one I think was sponsored by Johnson Matthey, who are big players in the catalysis production industry. They make many commercial catalysts all around the world for different processes. So we collaborated with them. We started out by just seeing what we could do by using the SAS method to prepare these copper zinc oxides. At the time, zincium malachite, so that's just malachite, which is a copper compound with the zinc, so zincium malachite. This was reported to be the sort of optimal precursor phase for this. And so we thought if we could make it via SAS, we might be able to increase the specific surface area, in particular the surface area of the copper, and also maximize the mixing of the copper and the zinc phases. So this little micrograph at the bottom I've taken from a paper, which shows that these catalysts tend to be formed of copper metal and also zinc oxide domains. And it's the interface of these two components, which is what we would call the active site or the active center. So maximizing this interface will maximize the activity of our catalyst. So the SAS preparation involved using copper zinc acetyl acetate or an acetate and the zinc acetate, 40 degrees, 110 bar of CO2, and some 5% 5% water in ethanol. So the idea, we'd run these through, we'd spray through a coaxial nozzle this powder, and we'd form malachite. But actually, what we found was we made a blue powder. And this is very unexpected. And so we'd obviously made something unusual, and we sort of reached for the mineralogy kind of literature to try and understand what this could be. So as I said, malachite, very common, characterized by this kind of green color. There are, of course, lots of different copper and copper zinc containing minerals out there. A couple of examples are aurochalcite and rosacite. And so we decided to try and characterize our unknown material to better understand it. And a recurring theme of this work is that the precursor composition and precursor phase is absolutely essential in determining the final properties of our catalyst, in this case, the copper zinc interface. And so understanding the precursor phases is key to developing these active catalysts. So on this slide, I have a series of infrared spectra. We have at the top our sort of standard malachite catalyst. At the bottom, we have a SAS-prepared smithsonite zinc carbonate sample. And in the two in the middle are our novel unknown catalyst precursors that we formed. Hopefully you can see visually that there are quite clear differences from this. And so we weren't able to confirm the presence of any kind of malachite phase or smithsonite phases. But with some careful scanning of the literature, we were able to match this pattern to something called georgite. Now, the quality of the spectra, as you can tell, isn't excellent. It hasn't been recently acquired. And that's because there's a very little literature out there on georgite. It's an incredibly rare mineral. It's very unstable in nature. And there's only, I think, 4 or 5 places in the world where it's been found. One of them is in Western Australia, where I've taken this image. So the georgite is this little region in the middle, and there's malachite all around it. And another one is actually the mountains in North Wales, coincidentally. But yeah, they tend to be formed in very small amounts. And they don't hang around in nature long because the presence of water and other metals can age them through into malachite. So in fact, actually, probably in our labs in Cardiff, we probably have the biggest deposits of georgite in the world, potentially. Fun fact. So having established the structure or the composition of our precipitate, we then needed to understand its catalytic properties and how it differed from malachite. So again, leaning on electron microscopy to learn more, we're able to find that the georgite, when you calcine it, it's formed of these very small, sort of 2 nanometer sized copper crystallites, whereas in the malachite, you have these larger crystallites. So again, thinking back to the active sites of that interfacial area and the copper surface area being key, we can already sense that the georgite is going to come out on top. So when we took this up to Johnson Matthey in Billingham, and we ran sort of not full scale or pilot plant scale, but smaller scale under industrial conditions and using their commercial catalyst, we were really surprised and pleased to find out that our georgite derived catalyst was actually outperforming the industrial catalyst quite significantly, whereas the malachite was less active. A key part of this is not only were we able to achieve a higher activity, we were also able to achieve a more stable catalyst. So catalyst deactivation, one of the main pillars of developing any catalyst is it has to be stable. If it's the best catalyst in the world in terms of activity, but it dies after a few minutes or hours, that's not going to be very useful. So really interesting. We were able to sort of look at understand the increased activity of the georgite derived sample compared to the malachite by considering that copper surface area, and we can draw quite clear correlations between those. But in terms of understanding the stability, that's actually a question we were never able to answer. Due to the nanostructure, there is some resistance to sort of copper agglomeration, and it may well be due to the fact that you have incredibly well dispersed components of copper and zinc oxide amongst each other. They don't have any extended copper domains. So I think this is a particularly interesting one because, as I said at the start, this is a catalyst that's been known about for more than 50 years, and there's been a lot of research in industry and academia to understand it and improve it. And using this SAS method, we were able to outdo a lot of that decades of research. So moving on now, and then just kind of demonstrating the breadth of applications that we have for these materials and catalysts. I'm just going to talk quite quickly about how we're able to investigate the effect of water. So in this particular case, we made catalysts without water, so just using supercritical CO2. What we find is the decomposition of this precipitate is very exothermic. You produce a lot of CO2, and this forms very large or relatively large copper and zinc oxide crystallites. Whereas in the presence of water, you retain this mesostructure, you form the hydroxycarbonates, and this retains a very interesting and useful nanostructure. If we translate that into experimental evidence, you can see as we increase the water content here, the copper surface area increases, and then it gets to a kind of plateau, and then it kind of comes down again. We'll just get to about 30%. The optimum seems to be between sort of 5 to 10. In terms of catalytic activity, what we find is without water, so these open circles at the bottom, you get very poor activity. But as soon as you introduce even 1% water and then 10 or even 30%, you can see we're starting to get conversions which are probably at equilibrium, so maximum conversion. I'm sure there will be questions about whether we have a single phase or whether there are multiple phases that exist in here. This isn't something that we directly probed, but I think these kind of mixture critical points are a very interesting aspect of this kind of chemistry. One more example is actually showing that we can use the SAS method to very precisely probe the presence of impurities and poisons. So sodium is a known poison for these catalysts. Using a sort of typical SAS method, we can really minimize the amount of sodium because we don't need any precipitating agents, which makes it particularly interesting. But we can also dope that back in a controlled way. And what we find is the more sodium you add, the worse methanol yield you get. And using an in situ XRD experiment, we can track the formation of copper crystallites. And then in the presence of water and sodium, you find that the copper crystallite increases very rapidly compared to in the sodium pure one, which is this line here. I won't talk about this in too much detail as I don't have time, but I want to just make the point that the complexity of these materials is also not a barrier. So we've been talking about binary copper zinc oxides. We can also introduce aluminium as a sort of refractory oxide to stabilize those phases. This doesn't compromise the performance of the catalyst. So this kind of SAS approach allows us to work with very complex materials very easily. And we demonstrated this in a recent publication for CO2 hydrogenation. So just going to summarize then, using this SAS approach, we're able to access chemical phases that were not previously known or possible using conventional methods. This was the success of this approach was due to the intimate mixing of the metals, which gave us a high active surface area and high catalyst activity. I didn't have time to touch on it, but what we were able to do actually is use the knowledge that this jaw-droite phase was active to develop a more conventional approach to preparing jaw-droite. And this also gave us an incredibly high activity. So some people say this kind of SAS approach isn't of interest commercially. And I think the presentations today have probably questioned that, certainly in the chemistry kind of domain. But it does show that we can use the knowledge gained from these experiments to then use more conventional approaches to preparing these catalysts. I wouldn't have enough space to say all the catalysts that are possible, but various oxides are all been shown in our labs and other labs that you can do this. In terms of the complexity of materials, I've got this doped perovskite here. So this is praseodymium, barium, cobalt oxide. This forms really phase pure perovskites, much more phase pure than the conventional methods. And this also gives it enhanced activity. So overall, a very powerful technique for catalyst preparation. I'm going to talk very briefly about what I think is very interesting. It's not something that we do in Cardiff, but certainly at Nottingham University, Martin Polyakov pioneered a lot of this work where they're actually doing chemical reactions using supercritical CO2. And one example I've pulled out is the conversion of levulinic acid to gamma-valerolactone, or GVL, which is an important reaction in the context of biomass. So schematically, this is very similar to what we described this morning in terms of feeding a supercritical CO2 and our substrate, in this case, levulinic acid. Also with the feed of hydrogen, this goes through to the reaction catalyst bed, and then you have some kind of analytical tool. It could be a GC, it could be an IR, and then you have your products at the end. So this montage here of the different phases kind of illustrates the exciting opportunities, I think, of doing chemistry in this context. So on the left-hand side here, you have the GVL and water. So this is your product and water without any CO2 added. When you add CO2, but at a sort of low pressure, shall we say, you can see you have phase separation. And so you've got water, you've got H2O, and you've got CO2 dissolved, but you've also got that gas phase above. When you increase the pressure above the critical temperature, critical pressure and temperature, what we see is this transformation. So you have a small phase at the bottom here, which is just water. You've got a mixture of GVL and CO2. You have some CO2 at the top. Now, the significance of this is that it shows that you can separate GVL from water. And this is really important because it means that you can have pure GVL production, and so no separation required, even when you're below 100% conversion. And I can think of lots of reactions where selectivity is a problem and you have sequential reactions that occur. If you can remove your products from the reactor, from that phase, you can kind of protect them from further, say, oxidation. And that could afford really high selectivity in yields. But that's something for the future. So just to summarize then, supercritical CO2 is an important and interesting fluid to use in the context of catalyst preparation. It's something that is fairly unique in what you can achieve with it. It's also not terribly widely applied in the catalysis community, which is good news for us because it gives us a niche. But it would be great to see more people pursuing this kind of catalyst development. We can afford very interesting and unusual phases, which then lead to very active and interesting catalysts. Reactions in supercritical CO2 are not that well studied, but there are exciting opportunities to try and exploit the separation of products from reactive media. But this coupled with this very complex phase behavior, so thinking about the mixture critical points of these systems is important to make sure that they're feasible. Just to finish with some acknowledgements then. So the georgite work, mostly done by the team here. I had a small part to play in it. In terms of the electron microscopy and tomography, we have a team of people here at Cardiff who have been instrumental with that. Johnson Matthey sponsored a lot of the georgite work. I've also included Total Energies to show that these types of experiments and research projects aren't just of interest to academia, but also there is industrial interest there too, which I think highlights that this is a applied translational type of work and not purely just fundamental.